YouTube or on the podcast website, you will know when to jump ahead to the forecast section and skip the news. So I want to give a brief overview first of the astrology of October before we jump into the news segment. Just give you a preview of what we're going to be talking about in this episode. This is the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the month and then how far through the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of the month. Next, we have the astrological transits calendar that was designed by Madeline Coates of honeycomb.co, where you can actually download this graphic for those watching the video version. And this just shows some of the different graphs, some of the different aspects that will go during the course of the month, and especially the different parts of the month where there's the budget aspects going exactly at once. Especially, for example, earlier in the month around the eclipse, or month around October 13th and 14th. We are still right in the middle of eclipse season, so we had our first eclipse season early in September and October again, with our next eclipse coming up in Libra on October 2nd. So this is a diagram that Matt and I were putting together from honeycomb.co just to show how things really ramp up and how the orb of eclipses is on either side. But in the middle between two eclipses, you're still in this very intense eclipse zone, so to speak, which is what we find ourselves in today. We are also starting the Mars retrograde shadow period on October 4th, so the ramp up to that begins with Mars at 17 degrees of Cancer. And finally, here's the planetary alignments calendar. So the at the top of the month is October 2nd, the solar eclipse in the sign of Libra, which is a major one. It's our last eclipse in that sign of Libra in the next 10 years. Then a few days later, Mercury squares Mars on the 6th of October. Jupiter stations retrograde in Gemini on the 9th. Pluto stations direct in Capricorn for its final station in Capricorn of the century on the 11th of October. Mercury moves into Scorpio on the 13th. The Sun squares Mars on the 14th, and the same day the Sun actually trines Jupiter as well. Then we get our second lunation of the month, which is a full moon in Aries on the 17th, and the same day Venus departs from Scorpio and moves into the sign of Sagittarius. The following week, the Sun moves into Scorpio on the 22nd, and at the end of the month, Venus squares Saturn on the 28th, and the Mars-Pluto opposition is building up and is within 3 degrees at this point by late October, and it will go exact in the early days of November. So, that is some of the astrology that we're going to be talking about during the course of this episode. But let's start first by talking about news and events. Most of the major news stories focused on eclipse season this month, since we already had the first eclipse on September 17th, which is a lunar eclipse in the sign of Pisces. And as some really focused on and talked about a lot over the past year on the podcast, eclipses have this most intense range that starts about 7 days before the eclipse, about a week before the eclipse, and about a week after. So that means our most intense eclipse range began around September 10th and lasted until around the 24th, 25th, so give or take. So in terms of news stories, the very first news story with that actually happened at the very beginning of that range on September 10th. So the first thing was that the presidential debate took place between Kamala Harris and former President Trump, and this eclipse took place in Harris's 10th house of career, reputation, and social standing, and she ended up winning the debate. Just, I think everybody pretty much agreed, whether you're for her or against her by the end, so that it ended up being a triumph for her, and then the polls went up in her favor afterwards, after that eclipse took place. So it was a really striking manifestation of an eclipse in a person's 10th house.
And so, so this was in her 10th, and this was on the North Node, or Robot, or the Dragon's Head. And something that I see quite commonly with eclipses on the Dragon's Head is that sometimes there will be a jump to a new level that people think a person was capable of, or a surprising or ambitious move. And not commenting specifically on the debate here, but sometimes you see people get in over their head, or they're like people. It looks like it's taking on a new thing. Think of the dragon's mouth it's a new level, or sometimes it's biting off more than you can chew. Sometimes it's being able to function at a higher level than or under more pressure than you or other people thought you could. And I think in the 10th, that's a pretty good example, because I try not to follow the electoral politics too closely for my mental health, but it was my understanding that that people were surprised by her performance, that they were surprised that she rose to that level and took a bite out of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely trepidation given how badly the debate went for the Democrats in June with Biden's performance, and how much that swung things, and people then realizing that this debate, unlike previous debate seasons where people commonly say that debates don't shift, elections, since we just had a debate where it did, and a candidate dropped out almost as a direct result of things, there was a lot of nervousness about how this would go. Yeah, but she really stepped up to the plate and rose to the occasion. In this instance, I think is what a lot of people saw, which is definitely a 10th house eclipse manifestation sometimes of rising to the occasion. So some of the things that happened, she ended up dating him like a few times, and he kind of freaked out and started talking about just nonsense about people eating cats and dogs. And he did get fact checked a few times, which is interesting manifestation of the Mercury-Saturn opposition, Mercury opposite Saturn and Neptune by sign. We had actually talked about that in the last episode, and how we thought that tension between those two would be Mercury in Virgo is like reporters attempting to fact check things when there's misinformation that's being spread around with Saturn conjunct Neptune and Pisces, and the inherent tension between those two. So some of afterwards, he wasn't happy about being fact-checked by the moderators, but then Democrats were also not super stoked that he ended up talking longer, that the moderators gave him more time to talk throughout the debate in the end as well, so that nobody was fully happy with the moderation. So he was kind of crushed so badly that he's currently dodging another debate, so it's not clear if there's going to be another presidential debate or if that will be the only one. But it's interesting if that is the only one, just that it coincided so closely with that eclipse, and now we're looking towards the next vice presidential debate that's about to take place on October 1st, and that's literally the day before the Libra eclipse that's about to take place on October 2nd. So having both of them occur so close to eclipses is notable. And we've been saying for months, I think since the year ahead forecast, that we expected these debates to be crucial because we saw that they were going to occur so close to eclipse season. So it's interesting to see that actually play out here.
Yeah, definitely. And you made an interesting statement that often debates don't seem to shift things with elections, or that is commonly said but not true this year. There seems to be a lot that's normally true that's not true this year with this election.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're supposed to normally in the election, we're supposed to be having 3 debates between the presidential candidates. So even the loss of that, of seeing these two go head to head, sort of like intellectually on a public stage, isn't happening. And that debate that we just had may be the only sort of one of that we get as a result of Trump this cycle. But we'll see what happens, since there's been another debate proposed for later in October by the Harris campaign and by CNN. So we'll see if Trump changes his mind and does it and relents and does it after the VP debate, just depending on how that goes. So in other news, in the middle of the month, it was around the time of the eclipse, there was a second assassination attempt on Trump on September 15th. This is just 2 days before the Pisces eclipse that took place on the 17th, which was in Trump's 8th house. And the main transit that I noted for him is just that transiting Uranus stationed retrograde at 27 Taurus, and it's retrograding back, so it's very closely square his Mars still in the 1st house. And I think that's one of the reasons that things like this have been coming up more from an astrological standpoint, is just that close configuration between Uranus and his Mars, which was activated most closely over the summer when there was a Mars-Uranus conjunction in Taurus. But that outer planet transit still present and still doing stuff there in this chart right now.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's just worth reiterating that the transit in Uranus, which is squaring his natal Mars, is just sitting on top of his midheaven. So it's on an extremely active angle in his chart. It's not just a Uranus Mars square.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So that was major, and then he also announced a cryptocurrency thing, which I thought was interesting. That's supposed to be run by his sons, which is another manifestation of the eclipse in his 8th house. And he was having a transit of Venus to his Jupiter at the time, which rules his 8th house and his 5th house of children. So, with the election, that eclipse was a final important turning point because Paris has Saturn transit through her 10th house right now, and so that eclipse was going to activate not just her 10th house, but was also going to emphasize that Saturn transit through the 10th. And there's a real question of whether the Saturn transit would be a barrier to what she's trying to accomplish right now. And the outcome of the debate was really going to be pivotal in terms of telling us how that transit was doing and what sort of obstacle or how much of an obstacle it would have or put in her path at this point. But in terms of where it's at this point, the two strongest indications that we have 2 indications in favor of Harris and one indication in favor of Trump. The 2 in favor of Harris are that eclipses are taking place in her angular houses, especially her 10th house, which is that Pisces eclipse that just took place. And every presidential candidate over the past 30 or 40 years that's had an eclipse happen in one of their angular houses around the time of the election has won. So in terms of eclipses, it seems like she has it in favor of her. And then in terms of the other indication is the zodiacal releasing, where her Time Lord periods, 1 and 2, are very positive and very eminent for her at this point, which we've talked about on previous episodes. Trump has one strongly point in favor of him, which is that he's going to start a major zodiac releasing Time Lord period, but not until April. So it's kind of curious because his chart does become more prominent for some reason early next year, but it's not clear if that's him doing something else that brings him into prominence, even if the election doesn't go the way that he wants it. But that's sort of the breakdown right now in terms of 2 of the main things that we've always looked at in terms of elections, other stuff like transits on election day, inauguration charts, and all sorts of other stuff like that. We did go into a bunch of that in an episode of the Secret Astrology podcast or a page on Patreon. So if people want a more detailed breakdown, they can look to that. But otherwise, we'll be looking forward to seeing how the VP debate goes and how some of the other transits play out over the course of the next few weeks.
Yeah, fascinating. I was going to say, what an unpredictable set of events this election has held so far. And yeah, we managed to get at least we get some of them, but and you've done a great job. But so many twists and turns. It will be really interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, well, the big thing that we're going to talk about in the forecast episode is the Mars-Pluto opposition. That's going to be crucial for the election and for everything that happens in between election and inauguration. So we have a lot of trepidation about it that we'll get into later in this episode, since that aspect is really going to come into close alignment starting in late October. So we'll talk about that more later in the episode. In other news, Israel and Lebanon, there was another major eclipse story where for months now we've been anticipating that the next chapter in the ongoing saga of what's happening with Israel would take place under this eclipse season, because everything started a year ago around the time of the first Libra eclipse in October of 2023. Then the next stage was the next set of eclipses in March and April, and that's when Iran and Israel started having open, direct conflict for the first time, with missiles being shot from Iran into Israel. And then now what happened is the very day of the Pisces eclipse on September 17th, Israel set off explosives that were hidden in pagers and other devices that injured something around people in Lebanon, and this seemed to be the opening sort of like attack in a what's like turning into a full war now between Israel and Lebanon, which has heated up since then, and now they're saying that they may be preparing for a ground invasion of Lebanon, which it's almost looking like may coincide around the time of that Libra eclipse that's about to take place in early October. So we're seeing the conflict there widening and becoming bigger, and there's a lot of nervousness about this turning into an even bigger regional war than it already was.
Yeah, one of the it was pretty striking to see that that happening on the day of the eclipse, and then on the next day and the next day. One of the things that I thought was sort of interesting was that so I've been looking at Iran's chart for a while, thinking about the difficulties in the region and the future. And so when that eclipse, leading up to that eclipse, I was curious about how the fact that the eclipse in late Pisces being right on top of Iran's natal Mercury and Mars, if we're using the April 1st, 1979 chart, would manifest. And so it's interesting that the event, like the pager attack, did not occur in Iran, but on Iran's Mercury. And this was we're looking at communication devices. We're certainly looking at Mercury being the vector for the attack. So it's interesting to me that the astrology seemed to point towards the connections between Hezbollah and Iran, just in the chart, and that it also suggests that it plays into that eclipse playing into Iran's chart plays into the escalation of hostilities, which I'm sure all would prefer did not happen, but looks like it seems in large part inevitable at this point.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things that really came up earlier this year, especially around the time of the Aries eclipse, when there started being that direct and open conflict between Iran and Israel. And that'll be something we'll have to look towards for the next set of eclipses, because this is going to be the final Libra eclipse here in October, but then there will be one last eclipse as part of this series, which will take place early next year in Aries. Although with this new conflict with Lebanon really accelerating on the Pisces eclipse, it's tricky because since that's the first eclipse in that series, it could be opening up a window of another series of eclipses that's going to follow through in the subsequent ones in that axis of like Pisces and Virgo. One of the things that I noticed that was notable is that on September 27th, Israel killed the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, and that was not too long after the Pisces eclipse. And I pulled up his chart, and it turns out that he was born just before a Pisces lunar eclipse. So it was another instance that we've seen so many of over the past year, especially with this conflict, of people that are born under eclipses having sometimes really important turning points in their life happen subsequently under eclipses, like in that instance.
Yeah, and it's important to note that eclipse, it literally foreshadows another 2 years of eclipses. I don't think we'll be done with the Virgo Pisces eclipses